At a gleaming Calabasas gas station, whispers ripple through the crowd as a Rolls-Royce purrs in, its opulence stealing every eye. Across the lot, a man hunches over his broken-down car, his fiancée's impatience sharp as the wrench in his hand slips. Their gazes, drawn to the luxury, freeze in shock. The driver is no stranger. She's his ex-wife, abandoned 5 years ago. Her dreams and identity scorned in a haze of betrayal. Once left in shadows, she now radiates triumph. Her presence a promise of reckoning. A storm of emotions brews, leading to a confrontation that will satisfy your soul. Subscribe and like for more gripping tales. The sun hung low over Calabasas, its amber rays licking the chrome rims of a Rolls-Royce Phantom drophead coupe, setting them ablaze as the car purred into the Chevron station on Agoura Road. Nia Thompson's fingers grazed the leather steering wheel, her pulse steady as the engine's hum. Her dark skin caught the light, glowing against the cream interior, and her oversized sunglasses shielded eyes that had seen too much to flinch now. A silk Hermès scarf danced lightly at her neck, teasing the breeze. She was no stranger to stares. Teenagers gawked from the sidewalk, their phones snapping feverishly, their whispers buzzing like flies. "That's a phantom, yo. Who's she?" Nia's lips curved, a flicker of amusement as she scrolled through her phone, emails from boardrooms and investors flitting under her thumb. The station's sleek pumps and polished concrete screamed money, a fitting stage for her arrival. She was Nia Thompson, CEO, a name that opened doors once slammed shut. 5 years ago, she'd been a shadow of this woman, scraping by in a dim Inglewood apartment, her dreams mocked, her heart shattered. Now the world bent to her will. Her gaze drifted to the attendant approaching, a young man with a grin too wide for minimum wage. "Phantom, right? Don't see those every day," he said, his voice bright with awe. Nia nodded, handing over her card, her fingers brushing the cool metal of her bracelet. "Keep it quick," she said softly, her tone warm but firm, a queen granting a favor. Inside, her chest tightened, not with fear, but with the weight of memory. This city, this air, it carried ghosts. She leaned back, the leather creaking softly, and let her eyes wander. The station was a microcosm of Calabasas' wealth. Teslas and Range Rovers idling, their drivers sipping overpriced coffee. But her attention snagged on a discordant note, a rusted Honda Civic across the lot, its hood propped up like a broken jaw. A man crouched beside it, his back hunched, his hands fumbling with tools. Her breath hitched, a needle-sharp prick in her chest. That slope of his shoulders, the way his head tilted, she knew him. Mark. Her fingers tightened around her phone, the screen blurring. 5 years ago, his voice had cut her to the bone. "You're nothing, Nia. You'll always be nothing." His words had been a blade, slicing through her dreams, her blackness, her very being. She'd clawed her way out of that pain, built an empire from code and tears. Now, here he was, a ghost in grease-stained khakis, wrestling with a car that looked as defeated as he did. Her pulse quickened, not with fear, but with something hotter, sharper, like the spark before a fire. She could drive away, let the past stay buried. But her body moved before her mind could argue, her hand reaching for the door handle. The attendant's voice broke her trance. "All set, ma'am. Want a receipt?" She shook her head, her eyes still on Mark, her smile tightening into something dangerous. The teenager's whispers grew louder, their phones now aimed at her as she stepped out, heels clicking like a metronome of intent. The air smelled of gasoline and privilege, and Nia breathed it in, letting it fuel her. She adjusted her blazer, the fabric whispering against her skin, and felt the weight of her own transformation. She wasn't the girl he'd left behind, the one he'd betrayed with Kaylee, The one he'd mocked for her roots, her skin, her ambition. She was a storm now, and storms don't ask permission to rage. Mark hadn't seen her yet, his head bowed over the engine, his curses muffled. Beside him stood a woman, blonde, tense, clutching a purse like a lifeline. Kaylee. Nia's stomach twisted, a flicker of old pain, but she crushed it down. Kaylee had been there smirking when Mark walked away, her laughter a second betrayal. Nia's fingers brushed her scarf, grounding herself in the present. She was no longer the woman they'd broken. The attendant lingered, sensing something brewing, his grin fading. Nia's heart thudded, a drumbeat of resolve. She could walk away, let them wallow in their smallness. But something deeper, something raw and unyielding, pulled her forward. Her heels struck the pavement, each step a declaration. She wasn't here to forgive or forget. She was here to be seen. As she moved, the teenagers fell silent, their phones poised like witnesses. The air thickened, charged with the promise of collision. Nia's breath was steady, but her mind raced, a kaleidoscope of hurt and triumph. Mark's world had once been her cage, his words her chains. Now she was free, and he was the one trapped. The thought sent a shiver through her, not of cold, but of power. She stopped a few paces away, her shadow falling over the Honda's hood. Mark's hands stilled, sensing the shift. Kaylee's head snapped up, her eyes narrowing. Nia didn't speak, not yet. She let the moment stretch, let the weight of her presence press against them. The past was a spark, and she was the flame. Mark Reynolds' knees ached against the concrete, the grit biting through his khakis as he hunched over the Honda Civic's open hood. The engine's innards stared back, a tangle of wires and rust, mocking him with their silence. His wrench slipped again, clattering to the pavement with a dull clang that echoed in his skull. "Damn it," he muttered, wiping sweat from his brow, the dampness stinging his eyes. His fingers, slick with grease, fumbled with the borrowed jumper cables, their frayed ends a testament to his desperation. The Chevron station's fluorescent lights buzzed overhead, casting his shadow long and jagged, a distorted mirror of the man he'd once been. Kaylee stood a few feet away, her arms crossed, her blonde ponytail taut as her patience. Her purse dangled from one hand, knuckles white around the strap, as if it could anchor her to some semblance of dignity. "This is ridiculous, Mark," she hissed, her voice low but sharp, slicing through the hum of idling engines. "We're gonna be late, again." Her eyes darted around the lot, flinching at the sleek SUVs and the teenagers still gawking at the Rolls-Royce across the way. She hated this, hated the stares, the pity, the way this place made their poverty scream. Mark didn't look at her. He couldn't. His wallet lay open on the ground, a pathetic spread of crumpled bills and loose change, barely enough for the gas he'd already pumped. 5 years ago, he'd had it all: trust fund, charm, a future that gleamed like the Calabasas skyline. Now, he was counting quarters, his life unraveling faster than the Civic's battery could die. His chest tightened, a knot of shame and rage. He'd made choices, bad ones, and they'd led him here, to this moment, this lot, this broken-down heap. Kaylee shifted, her sneakers scuffing the pavement. "Can't you just call a tow truck?" She pressed, her voice climbing, brittle with frustration. "We can't keep doing this." Mark's jaw clenched, his teeth grinding. A tow truck meant money they didn't have, another bill to dodge, another fight waiting at home. "I'm handling it," he snapped, though his hand shook as he clipped the cables to the battery. Handling it. Like he'd handled everything else. His career, his savings, his pride. The teenagers' laughter cut through the air, sharp and careless, their phones now aimed at something else, someone else. Mark's neck prickled, a warning he couldn't place. He glanced up, squinting against the glare, and saw the Rolls-Royce again, its black curves glinting like a predator in wait. Kaylee followed his gaze, her lips parting. God, that car, she muttered, envy curling her words. Bet they don't have to deal with this crap. Mark grunted, his focus back on the engine, but his hands faltered. The air felt heavier now, charged with something he couldn't name. His fingers brushed the battery's corroded terminal, and a jolt of static snapped against his skin, making him flinch. He cursed again, softer this time, as if the world was listening too closely. Kaylee's voice softened, but not with kindness, more like resignation. You sure you know what you're doing? He didn't. He never had, not really. 5 years ago, he'd walked away from Nia, his wife, his college sweetheart, with a smug certainty that he was trading up. Kaylee had been his escape, a blonde trophy who fit the world he thought he deserved. He'd told himself Nia was too much, too loud, too ambitious, too black for the polished life he'd imagined. He'd left her in that Inglewood dive, her dreams of code and startups laughable to him then. Kaylee had smirked at her tears and he'd let her, believing he was free. Now freedom tasted like gasoline fumes and regret. His hands trembled, the cables slipping again. Kaylee's sigh was a blade, cutting deeper than she knew. Maybe we should just walk, she said, her voice barely above a whisper, but it carried the weight of their shared failures. Mark's throat burned, words he couldn't say choking him. He'd lost everything. His money, his status, his certainty, and the Civic's refusal to start was just another slap from fate. The attendant, Carlos, lingered nearby, his rag moving in slow circles over a pump, his eyes flicking toward them. Mark felt the weight of his gaze, the judgment of a stranger who saw too much. The teenagers' whispers grew louder, their laughter sharper, and Mark's skin crawled. He wanted to scream, to tell them all to look away, to leave him to his misery. But the air shifted again, a shadow falling across the hood, cool and deliberate, like a storm cloud swallowing the sun. He didn't look up. He didn't need to. His body knew before his mind did. The scent of jasmine perfume, the rhythm of heels on pavement. His heart thudded, a traitor giving him away. Kaylee's breath caught, her posture stiffening. "Mark?" she said, her voice tight, uncertain. He gripped the cables harder, his knuckles whitening, as the shadow loomed closer. The past wasn't done with him yet. Kaylee's fingers tightened around her purse, the leather creaking under her grip as her eyes snagged on the Rolls-Royce across the lot. Its black curves gleamed under the chevron's lights, a taunt of wealth she'd never touch. "God, look at that car," she said, her voice low, laced with a hunger that made her cheeks flush. She nudged Mark, who was still crouched over the Honda's engine, his curses swallowed by the hum of the station. "Who drives something like that around here?" Her words were half wistful, half bitter, her ponytail flicking as she tilted her head. Mark's shoulders stiffened, his wrench scraping against the battery with a screech that set his teeth on edge. "Some rich wannabe, probably," he muttered, not looking up, his voice rough with irritation. Sweat stung his eyes and he swiped at it, smearing grease across his forehead. The cables in his hands felt like chains, heavy with the weight of his failures. He didn't want to look at the Rolls-Royce, didn't want to see the life he'd lost reflected in its polish. But Kaylee's gaze lingered, her envy a palpable thing, and it pricked at him, a reminder of how far they'd fallen. The attendant, Carlos, crossed the lot, his sneakers scuffing lightly on the concrete. He approached the Rolls-Royce, his grin wide, almost reverent. "Phantom, right? Don't see those every day," he said, his voice carrying over the hum of idling engines. The driver's door opened and a woman stepped out, heels sharp against the pavement, blazer tailored to perfection, diamonds glinting at her ears. Mark's breath hitched, his hands freezing on the cables. His body knew before his mind caught up. The curve of her jaw, the way she held herself like she owned the ground she walked on. Nia. His heart slammed against his ribs, a frantic rhythm that drowned out the station's noise. He glanced up just for a second, and their eyes locked. Hers, dark, unyielding, cutting through him like glass. His mouth went dry, his fingers slipping on the wrench. Nia's expression didn't shift, but something flickered in her gaze, a spark of recognition, of memory, of something sharper. Mark looked away, his face burning, the cables trembling in his hands. He felt exposed, raw, like the sun had stripped him bare. Kaylee's head snapped toward Nia, her smile vanishing as if slapped away. Her eyes narrowed, her lips parting in a soft hiss. "Her?" she whispered, the word dripping with venom, her body coiling like a spring. She knew Nia, knew her as the woman Mark had left, the wife she'd helped him betray. 5 years ago, Kaylee had stood by his side, her laughter a cruel echo as Nia's world crumbled. Now, seeing Nia step from that car, her confidence ablaze, Kaylee's stomach twisted, a cocktail of jealousy and dread. "Mark, you okay?" Kaylee's voice was tight, her question less concern than accusation. She stepped closer, her sneakers squeaking, her eyes darting between him and Nia. Mark didn't answer, couldn't. His throat was a knot, his mind a blur of memories. Nia's tears, her voice pleading, his own sneering words. "You'll never fit in my world," he told her, his tone dripping with superiority, as if her blackness, her ambition, her very existence were flaws. Kaylee had smirked then, her arm looped through his, a trophy he'd thought he'd won. Now Nia stood there, a vision of triumph, her scarf catching the breeze like a flag of victory. Mark's hand shook, the cables slipping again, and he cursed under his breath. The sound swallowed by the station's hum. He wanted to disappear, to melt into the concrete, but her presence pinned him, a spotlight on his shame. Kaylee's fingers dug into her purse, her knuckles white, her face a mask of resentment. She didn't speak again, but her silence screamed a challenge to the woman who'd once been nothing to her. Carlos handed Nia her card, his grin faltering as he sensed the shift in the air. The teenagers across the lot had stopped snapping photos, their whispers hushed, their phones now poised like weapons, ready to capture whatever came next. Nia's heels clicked once more as she turned, her gaze sweeping the lot, lingering on Mark for a heartbeat longer than necessary. His chest burned, a mix of guilt and fear, the weight of his past mistakes crushing him. Kaylee's breath was shallow, her eyes locked on Nia, her mind racing. She remembered Nia's pain, the way it had made her feel powerful, superior. But now that power was gone, replaced by a gnawing unease. Nia wasn't the broken woman they'd left behind. She was something else, something unstoppable, and Kaylee hated her for it. Mark's hands fumbled, the cables useless in his grip. He felt her eyes on him, felt the years collapse between them. The station's lights buzzed, the air thick with gasoline and tension. Nia didn't move toward him, not yet, but her presence was a storm gathering, and he was already caught in its pull. Nia's breath caught in her throat, a sharp, fleeting pang as she watched Mark fumble with the cables, his hands trembling like leaves in a storm. The Chevron station's hum faded, drowned by the pulse in her ears, each beat a drumroll of memory. 5 years ago he'd been her world, her husband, her anchor, his promises as bright as the Calabasas sun. Now he was a stranger in stained khakis, his defeat written in the slump of his shoulders. Her fingers brushed the silk scarf at her neck, grounding her, tethering her to the woman she'd become. She wasn't that girl anymore, the one he'd broken, but the scars still whispered. Her mind spiraled back, unbidden, to that Inglewood apartment, its walls thin as her hopes. Mark's voice, cold and cutting, echoed in her skull. "You'll never fit in my world, Nia. You're too loud, you." His words had been a blade, slicing through her blackness, her dreams, her love. He'd stood there, Kaylee at his side, her blonde hair gleaming under the fluorescent lights, her smirk a second betrayal. Mark had cheated, chosen Kaylee, a woman who fit his vision of refinement, of whiteness, of ease. Naya's pleas had meant nothing. Her tears had only fueled Kaylee's triumph. "She's nothing," Kaylee had whispered, her voice a venomous hiss, and Mark hadn't disagreed. Nia's chest tightened, the old hurt flaring like a phantom limb. She'd been a waitress then, coding at night, her laptop's glow her only solace. Mark had mocked her ambition, called her startups a pipe dream, her blackness a flaw he couldn't overlook. "You're not enough," he'd said, and Kaylee's laughter had sealed the wound. But Nia hadn't broken, not completely. She'd clawed through the pain, her fingers bleeding on keyboards, her heart stitching itself back together with every line of code. Now she was a CEO, her name a currency, her empire a fortress built from the rubble of their betrayal. Her eyes flicked to Kaylee, who stood rigid, her purse clutched like a shield. The woman's face was a mask of resentment, her lips pressed thin, her eyes narrowing as they met Nia's. Kaylee knew her, knew the wife she'd helped destroy, the woman she'd dismissed as lesser. Nia's pulse quickened, not with fear but with a fire that had been smoldering for years. She could still hear Kaylee's laugh, see her arm looped through Mark's, her confidence a mirror to Nia's despair. Now that confidence was cracking, and Nia felt a dangerous thrill at the sight. Mark's hands stilled on the cables, his head bowed, as if he could hide from her gaze. He couldn't. Nia's presence was a weight, a reckoning, and she knew he felt it. Her heels had stopped clicking, but the air thrummed with her intent. She could walk away, let them stew in their smallness, but something deeper, something raw and unyielding, held her there. Her fingers flexed, the cool metal of her bracelet a reminder of her power. She wasn't here to beg or plead. She was here to stand, to be seen, to let them choke on the truth of her triumph. Kaylee's voice cut through the silence, sharp and brittle. "Mark, what's she doing here?" Her tone was a blade, slicing through the tension, her eyes darting to Nia with a mix of defiance and dread. Mark didn't answer, his jaw tight, his gaze fixed on the engine as if it could save him. Nia's lips twitched, a ghost of a smile. She remembered Kaylee's smirk, the way it had burned into her soul. Now Kaylee's face was flushed, her confidence unraveling, and Nia savored the shift, a predator tasting blood. The teenagers across the lot had gone quiet, their phones poised, their whispers hushed. Carlos, the attendant, lingered by a pump, his rag moving in slow, distracted circles. The station's lights buzzed, a harsh counterpoint to the softness of Nia's scarf fluttering in the breeze. Her heart was a drum, steady but fierce, each beat a declaration. She'd built a world from nothing, turned their scorn into fuel. Mark had tried to erase her, Kaylee had laughed at her pain, but Nia had risen, higher, stronger, untouchable. Her eyes locked on Mark again, his hands shaking, the cables useless in his grip. She saw the boy he'd been, the one who'd promised forever, and the man who'd chosen betrayal over love. She saw Kaylee, too, her smugness now a fragile shell, her eyes betraying a flicker of fear. Nia's breath steadied, her resolve hardening. She didn't need their apologies, their regret. She needed them to see her, to see the woman they'd underestimated, the one who'd turned their cruelty into power. The air thickened, charged with the promise of collision. Nia took a step forward, her heels a quiet warning. Mark's shoulders hunched, as if he could feel her closing in. Kaylee's grip on her purse tightened, her knuckles white, her resentment a living thing. Nia's heart burned, not with pain, but with purpose. The past was a shadow, but she was the light, and she would make them face it. Nia's heels struck the pavement, each click a heartbeat, a countdown to collision. The air at the Chevron station was thick with gasoline fumes and unspoken debts, her silk scarf fluttering like a war flag. Her blazer hugged her frame, diamonds glinting at her ears, every detail a testament to the empire she'd forged. Her eyes, shielded by sunglasses, burned with a clarity that cut through the haze of memory. Mark's hunched form was a magnet, drawing her closer, her steps deliberate, unyielding. She wasn't the girl he'd left behind, the one he'd betrayed with Kaylee's laughter ringing in her ears. She was a force now, and forces don't falter. Kaylee's posture stiffened, her arms crossed tighter, her purse a flimsy shield against Nia's approach. Her lips were a thin line, her eyes narrowing to slits, resentment radiating like heat from asphalt. She knew Nia, knew the wife she'd helped shatter, the woman she'd dismissed as lesser. Her fingers twitched, betraying a flicker of unease, but her chin lifted, defiant as if she could will away the truth standing before her. Nia felt it, the weight of Kaylee's disdain, and it only sharpened her resolve. Her heart thudded not with fear, but with a fierce, quiet joy, the kind that comes from knowing you've already won. Mark's hands fumbled with the jumper cables, his knuckles white, the metal scraping against the battery with a sound like nails on a chalkboard. He didn't look up, but his shoulders hunched tighter, as if he could shrink from her presence. The teenagers across the lot had gone still, their phones poised, their silence a chorus of anticipation. Carlos, the attendant, slowed his ragged circles, his eyes flicking between Nia and the broken-down Honda. The station's buzz felt distant, the world narrowing to this moment, this confrontation, this reckoning. Nia stopped a few paces away, her shadow falling over Mark like a guillotine. Her breath was steady, but inside, her thoughts churned. A kaleidoscope of pain, triumph, and something darker, something that wanted to see him break. 5 years ago, he'd stood over her, his words a whip, his betrayal a brand. "You're too loud, too you," he'd said, Kaylee smirking at his side, their laughter a chorus of cruelty. Now, he was the one diminished, his grease-stained hands a map of his failures. Nia's fingers brushed her bracelet, the cool metal grounding her, a reminder of the life she'd built from their wreckage. "Mark," she said, her voice low, sharp, slicing through the air like a blade wrapped in velvet. His head jerked up, the wrench slipping from his grip, clattering to the pavement with a sound that echoed in her chest. His eyes met hers, wide and bloodshot, the color draining from his face. He looked like a man caught in a storm, no shelter in sight. Nia's lips twitched, not quite a smile, but something closer to a challenge. She let the moment stretch, let his shame fill the space between them. Kaylee stepped forward, her sneakers squeaking, her voice a hiss. "What do you want?" Her words were barbed, but they trembled, betraying her. Nia's gaze flicked to her, cool and unyielding, taking in the blonde ponytail, the clenched jaw, the eyes that burned with a mix of jealousy and fear. Kaylee's resentment was a living thing, a ghost of the past that had once laughed at Nia's tears. Now it was Kaylee who looked small, her defiance crumbling under the weight of Nia's presence. Mark stammered, his voice barely a whisper. "Nia?" It was a question, a plea, a confession all at once. His hands hung useless at his sides, the cables dangling like broken promises. Nia's heart pounded, a drumbeat of resolve, but she kept her face still, her sunglasses a shield. She remembered his arms around Kaylee, the way he'd turned away from her, his world a door slammed in her face. She remembered coding through the night, her fingers trembling, her dreams the only thing keeping her alive. Now, those dreams were her crown, and she wore them without apology. Kaylee's eyes darted to Mark, then back to Nia, her voice sharper now. Why are you here? It wasn't a question. It was a challenge, laced with the old superiority she'd wielded like a weapon. Nia's chest tightened, the memory of Kaylee's smirk flashing bright, but she pushed it down, her resolve steel. She took another step, closing the distance, her heels a quiet thunder. The teenager's whispers had stopped, the station's hum fading to a distant drone. Carlos's rags stilled, his eyes wide, sensing the storm about to break. Nia's voice was steady, but it carried an edge, a promise. I'm just passing through, she said, her words deliberate, each one a stone dropped into still water. Mark's face crumpled, his eyes flicking to the Rolls-Royce behind her, its gleam a silent rebuke. Kaylee's jaw tightened, her fingers digging into her purse, her resentment a pulse in the air. Nia felt it all, their shame, their fear, their crumbling facades, and it fueled her. She wasn't here to forgive. She was here to be seen, to let them choke on the truth of her. The air crackled, the tension a wire pulled taut. Nia stood tall, her shadow swallowing them both, her heart a furnace of memory and triumph. They'd tried to break her once, but she'd risen, and now they would face the woman she'd become. Nia stood, a pillar of fire in tailored silk, her shadow pinning Mark to the concrete like a confession, her voice low and sharp, cut through the Chevron station's hum, each word a blade honed by 5 years of pain. Mark, she said again, her tone steady but laced with steel, you look like you've seen a ghost. Her sunglasses hid her eyes, but her lips curved, a smile that wasn't kind, wasn't cruel, just true. Mark's face was a ruin, pale and sweating, his eyes darting like a trapped animal's. The wrench lay forgotten at his feet, the jumper cables trembling in his hands, a lifeline that couldn't save him now. Kaylee's sneakers scraped the pavement as she stepped closer, her arms uncrossing, her purse dangling like an afterthought. What do you want? She snapped, her voice a whip, but it cracked with uncertainty, her blue eyes blazing with resentment. She knew Nia, knew the wife she'd stolen Mark from, the woman she'd laughed at as they walked away. Now, Nia's presence was a mirror, reflecting Kaylee's own fragility, and she hated it, her jaw tight, her fingers twitching with the urge to claw back control. Nia's smile didn't waver, but inside her heart roared, a furnace fed by their betrayal. Mark's throat bobbed, his voice a rasp. Nia, He trailed off, his eyes flicking to the Rolls-Royce, its gleam a silent accusation. He saw it, the life she'd built, the empire she'd forged from the ashes he'd left behind. His hands shook, the cables slipping, and he gripped them tighter, as if they could anchor him against the tide of his guilt. 5 years ago he'd stood tall, his words venomous, his arm around Kaylee as he tore Nia apart. You're too loud, too you, he'd said, his sneer cutting deeper than any knife, her blackness a flaw in his polished world. Kaylee's laughter had been the salt in the wound. Nia took a step closer, her heels a quiet drumbeat, her breath steady but burning. Funny, isn't it? She said, her voice soft but piercing, each word a stone dropped into their silence. You said I'd never amount to anything, Mark. Said I didn't belong in your world. You and Kaylee made that crystal clear when you walked away. She gestured toward the Rolls-Royce, its curves a taunt, its polish mocking his grease-stained hands. You didn't just break my heart. You tried to break me because of my skin, my roots, my dreams. Kaylee's face flushed, her lips parting, but her words came out sharp and brittle. That's ancient history, she said, her voice trembling with defiance, her eyes darting to Mark for support he couldn't give. Why drag it up now? But her posture betrayed her, her shoulders hunching slightly, her purse swinging like a pendulum. She remembered standing by Mark, her smirk a weapon, her laughter a crown she'd worn as Nia wept. Now that crown was tarnished, and Nia's triumph was a blade at her throat. Nia's gaze shifted to Kaylee, cool and unflinching, her heart a storm of memory and resolve. "Ancient history," she said, her voice a quiet thunder. "You laughed, Kaylee. You stood there, arm in arm with him, and laughed as he tore me down, told me I was nothing because I wasn't like you." Her words hung in the air, heavy with truth, and Kaylee's face crumpled, her defiance cracking like thin ice. Nia's chest tightened, the old pain flaring, but she crushed it down, her strength a fortress. She'd coded through those tears, built a life they couldn't touch. Mark's eyes dropped to the pavement, his shoulders sagging, the cables useless in his grip. "I didn't mean," he started, but his voice broke, a whisper drowned by the station's hum. He couldn't finish, couldn't face the weight of his own words, the racism and betrayal he'd wielded like a club. Nia's smile faded, her lips a straight line, her heart a drumbeat of justice. She remembered the nights in Inglewood, her laptop's glow her only light, her dreams the only thing keeping her alive. Now those dreams were her armor, and she wore them without apology. The teenagers across the lot were silent, their phones still raised, capturing the unraveling of a man and a woman who'd once thought themselves untouchable. Carlos, the attendant, stood frozen, his rag limp in his hand, his eyes wide with the weight of the moment. The air crackled, the tension a wire stretched to breaking. Nia's voice softened, but it carried an edge, a promise. "Look at us now, Mark," she said, her words a verdict. "I built my world. Where's yours?" Kaylee's breath hitched, her eyes flashing with anger, but she said nothing, her silence a confession. Mark's hands trembled, the cables falling to the ground, a surrender he couldn't voice. Nia stood tall, her shadow swallowing them both, her heart a furnace of triumph and pain. She'd faced their cruelty, their betrayal, and turned it into power. Now they would face her, and the truth of what they'd done. The air at the Chevron station hung heavy, thick with the residue of Nia's words, each one a stone cast into the still pool of Mark's shame. Her shadow loomed, a dark tide over the broken-down Honda, her presence a mirror reflecting his ruin. Mark's hands dangled uselessly, the jumper cables a tangled heap at his feet, their frayed ends a map of his unraveling. His jaw clenched, teeth grinding, but no words came, only a ragged breath, sharp and shallow like a man drowning on dry land. His eyes, bloodshot and wide, stayed fixed on the pavement, as if it could swallow him whole, erase the ghost of his betrayal standing before him. Kaylee's face was a storm, her cheeks flushed crimson, her lips trembling with the urge to strike back. Her purse swung slightly, her knuckles white, her eyes darting between Nia's Rolls-Royce and the rusted Civic, a silent scream of envy and defeat. "We don't need this," she snapped, her voice brittle, cracking like glass underfoot. She grabbed Mark's arm, her nails digging into his sleeve, a desperate tug to pull him from the wreckage of this moment. But Mark didn't move, his body rooted, his silence a confession louder than any words. Kaylee's breath hitched, her defiance crumbling, her resentment a fire that burned only her. Nia stood motionless, her heels silent now, her blazer catching the station's lights like a second skin. Her heart pounded, a fierce rhythm of triumph and pain, but her face remained a mask, cool, unyielding, a queen surveying a fallen court. She saw it all, Mark's slumped shoulders, the grease smeared across his brow, the man who'd once stood tall as he tore her apart. She saw Kaylee's clenched jaw, the flicker of fear in her eyes, the woman who'd laughed as Nia's world collapsed. 5 years ago, they'd been untouchable, their cruelty a crown. Now it was Nia who wore the crown, forged from code and tears, and they couldn't look away. You thought you'd won, Kaylee, Naya said, her voice soft but sharp, a needle slipping beneath the skin. You stood there, arm in arm with him, laughing as he told me I was nothing. You thought you'd taken something from me. Her words hung, heavy and deliberate, each one a verdict. Kaylee's eyes flashed, her lips parting, but no sound came, only a sharp inhale, a gasp of guilt and rage. Nia's gaze shifted to Mark, her sunglasses glinting, her heart a furnace. And you, Mark. You said I didn't belong because of my skin, my roots, my dreams. You tried to erase me. Mark's throat bobbed, a dry swallow, his hands twitching as if to reach for something he'd lost. Nia, His voice was a croak, barely audible, drowned by the buzz of the station's lights. He couldn't finish, couldn't face the truth she'd laid bare. His eyes flicked to the Rolls-Royce, its sleek lines a monument to her victory, and his shoulders sagged further, his body folding under the weight of his own failures. He remembered her tears, her pleas, the way he'd turned away, Kaylee's arm in his, their laughter, a wall between him and her pain. Now, that wall was dust. Kaylee tugged harder at his arm, her voice rising, desperate. Let's go, Mark. This is pointless. But her words lacked conviction, her eyes betraying her, wide, wet, caught between anger and shame. She saw the teenagers across the lot, their phones raised, capturing her unraveling. She saw Carlos, the attendant, his rag limp, his gaze heavy with judgment. The station was a stage, and they were the fools exposed under Nia's unflinching light. Kaylee's chest burned, her mind replaying that day 5 years ago, her smirk, her triumph, the way she'd felt invincible. Now Naya's success was a blade, and Kaylee was bleeding. Naya's lips curved, a faint smile, not of joy but of justice. She remembered the nights in Inglewood, her laptop's glow her only companion, her fingers trembling as she coded through the pain. She remembered Mark's sneer, Kaylee's laugh, the way they'd tried to strip her of her worth. But she'd risen, built a world they couldn't touch, a life they couldn't fathom. Her heart thudded, a drumbeat of resolve, and she took a slow breath, the air tasting of gasoline and vindication. I built my world, she said, her voice steady, final. Where's yours? The question landed like a gavel, and the silence that followed was deafening. Mark's head bowed lower, his hands limp, the cables a forgotten relic of his defeat. Kaylee's grip on his arm slackened, her face a mask of resentment and fear, her eyes locked on Nia's Rolls-Royce as if it could burn her. The teenagers' whispers were gone, their phones still, the station holding its breath. Carlos stood frozen, his rag dangling, his eyes wide with the weight of the moment. Nia's heart was aflame, steady and fierce, her triumph a quiet roar. She'd faced their cruelty and turned it into power. Now they would face her. Nia's words hung in the air, a verdict carved in stone, their weight pressing Mark and Kaylee into the concrete of the Chevron station. Her shadow, cast long by the dying sun, swallowed them whole, a dark tide receding only as she turned, her heels clicking with the finality of a gavel. Her silk scarf fluttered, a whisper of triumph, as she walked back to the Rolls-Royce, each step a severance from the past. Her heart thrummed, a steady pulse of fire, not rage, but something purer, resolution. She'd faced them, bared their sins, and emerged unbroken. The station's hum faded, the world narrowing to the rhythm of her breath, the cool leather waiting to embrace her. Mark remained crouched, his hands limp, the jumper cables a tangled epitaph at his feet. His face was a ruin, pale and hollow, his eyes fixed on the pavement as if it could shield him from the truth. Her truth. His chest ached, a dull, gnawing pain, not just from shame, but from the ghost of who he'd been, arrogant, certain, cruel. 5 years ago, he'd walked away from Nia, Kaylee on his arm, her laughter a crown he'd worn proudly. He'd called Nia nothing, her blackness a flaw, her dreams a joke. Now her Rolls-Royce gleamed like a rebuke, and he was the one diminished. His world a rusted Honda and a wallet full of regrets. Kaylee's breath was shallow, her face flushed with a fury she couldn't voice. Her purse dangled, forgotten, her fingers twitching with the urge to lash out, to reclaim something, anything, from this moment. Nia's words echoed in her skull. You thought you'd won. She had once. She'd stood by Mark, her smirk a weapon, her whiteness a shield, believing she'd taken his future from Nia. Now Nia's triumph was a mirror, reflecting Kaylee's own fragility, her life tethered to a man who couldn't even start a car. Her eyes burned, wet with unshed tears, her resentment a knot in her throat. She wanted to scream, but the station's silence held her captive. Nia slid into the Rolls-Royce, the leather creaking softly, a sound as intimate as a lover's whisper. Her fingers grazed the steering wheel, the cool metal of her bracelet grounding her, a reminder of the empire she'd built. She didn't look back, not yet. The engine purred to life, a low, powerful hum that drowned out the station's buzz, a song of freedom. Her sunglasses slipped down her nose and she pushed them up, her lips curving into a faint private smile. She didn't need their apologies, their regret. She'd needed them to see her, the woman who'd risen from their cruelty, who'd turned their scorn into steel. The teenagers across the lot stood frozen, their phones limp, their whispers dead. Carlos, the attendant, clutched his rag, his eyes wide as if he'd witnessed a trial and its verdict. The station's lights flickered, casting jagged shadows, but Nia was untouched, her presence a beacon in the dusk. She shifted the car into gear, the Rolls-Royce gliding forward, smooth and unyielding, a chariot carrying her away from their wreckage. Her heart was aflame, steady and fierce, burning away the last traces of their power over her. Kaylee's hand fell from Mark's arm, her fingers trembling, her face a mask of defeat. "Mark," she whispered, her voice cracking. But he didn't respond, his head still bowed, his shame a weight too heavy to lift. She saw Nia's car move, its curves catching the light, and her chest tightened, a mix of envy and despair. She'd laughed at Nia's pain, believed she'd won, but now she stood in the dust of her own choices, tethered to a man who'd lost everything. Her eyes stung, but she blinked hard, refusing to let the tears fall. Nia's gaze flicked to the rearview mirror as she pulled onto the Pacific Coast Highway, the ocean shimmering to her left, a vast, endless promise. Mark was a speck now, crouched by his broken-down Civic, Kaylee a shadow beside him, her face tight with resentment. The wind caught Nia's scarf, sending it dancing, a flag of victory. Her heart swelled, not with joy, but with something deeper, redemption. She'd coded through nights of tears, built a world from nothing, defied every voice that called her less. Mark's betrayal, Kaylee's laughter, their racism, they were ashes now, scattered by her rise. The highway stretched before her, a ribbon of possibility, the sea's rhythm syncing with her pulse. She didn't need their sorrow, their guilt. She'd needed this moment, this collision, to stand as the woman she'd become, unapologetic, unstoppable. Her fingers tightened on the wheel, the engines hum a hymn to her strength. She was Nia Thompson, CEO, a name that opened doors and broke chains. The past was behind her, fading in the mirror, and the future was hers alone. In a sunlit clash at a Calabasas gas station, a woman's triumphant return in a Rolls-Royce unveils a raw confrontation with her ex-husband's betrayal and a rival's scorn. Through searing dialogue and unspoken wounds, she reclaims her power, leaving their shame in the dust. Thank you for diving into this emotional journey with us. Your support fuels these stories, so please subscribe to our channel for more tales of heartbreak, redemption, and resilience. Stay tuned for the next chapter. We can't wait to share it with you.